大家好，讀你聽嘅時間，今日繼續讀 Michael Lewis 嘅 Liar's Poker， 讀到第7節啦。上一回就講到 Mortgage Bond 啦 ，Salomon Brothers Mortgage Bond Department 嘅土崩瓦解啦，去到後期原罪就係挖角啦，亦都係公司高層嘅貪念啦，分得唔夠多啦，俾啲下屬啦，令到其他嘅投行咧就高薪挖角。呢一節咧就個時間軸咧就繼續向前推嘅。Mortgage Department 雖然瓦解咗啫，咁仲有其他 department 喺度噶嘛。咁 Salomon Brothers 點樣力挽狂瀾呢？咁我哋繼續睇落去啦。Chapter 7 The Salomon Diet 1986 to 1988 The bond market and the people market sought their respective equilibriums, and in the 2 years following the dinner at Le Perregaux, the mortgage department of Salomon Brothers disintegrated.A departing trader could indeed be replaced by other bright young men from the nation's leading business schools. With the $1 million Salomon saved by not meeting Howie Rubin's demands, it bought a dozen new Rubins. The replacements looked pretty much like the original. However, they didn't make nearly as much money for Salomon Brothers, for, unlike their predecessor, they had to compete with the best.Shearson Lehman, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Drexel Burnham, First Boston, and Merrill Lynch employed former Salomon traders. There was a growing club of men on Wall Street who said with a smile that Salomon Brothers was a great place to be from. By allowing dozens of able mortgage traders to fertilize the mortgage departments of other firms, Salomon Brothers let slip through its fingers the rarest and most valuable asset a Wall Street firm can possess.A monopoly. Ranieri & Co. had been a more airtight monopoly than even the people at Salomon Brothers knew. Between 1981 and 1985, the only noticeable competition had been First Boston, and even it, early on, wasn't a serious threat. Marvin Williamson, a Salomon Brothers mortgage salesman who moved to First Boston in late 1982, recalls that at the time at Salomon, we thought First Boston was behind every rock.Not only were they not behind every rock, they didn't even know where the rocks were. Yet by the middle of 1986, First Boston could boast about the same market share in mortgage securities as Salomon Brothers. Ranieri didn't like what he saw, and he let Gutfreund know. He says, I kept telling him, John, you're selling the technology for a hill of magic beans.There is no chance that the rest of Wall Street would have permitted Salomon Brothers to maintain its hammerlock on the mortgage market. Eventually, other firms would have caught on to our tricks because mortgages were too profitable to ignore, but the process was accelerated by our policies.The traders who left Salomon Brothers provided Wall Street not only with trading skills and market understanding, but also with a complete list of Salomon Brothers customers. Now the traders had a short-term incentive to educate the fool, show the fool how much he was paying to Salomon Brothers, and perhaps he'd give his business to you. The transfer of skills and information probably cost Salomon Brothers hundreds of millions of dollars. In the early days of trading,Mortgage bonds were profitable because the traders could buy them at one price and sell them almost instantly at a much higher price. A trader would pay a thrift in Kansas 94 for a bond, then sell it to a thrift in Texas at 95. By early 1986, margins had narrowed. A trader paid 94.5 for a bond, which he might just possibly, on a good day, sell at 94.55. Michael Matara says we'd see them at work on the screens.Or the customers would tell us that they had dealt with them. We started to miss trades, and we finally had to cut our spreads. Toward the end of 1985, the mortgage trading departments of other firms began to advertise in the Wall Street Journal. Drexel Burnham ran one showing two men on a tandem bicycle. The one in front was hugely fat and slumped in exhaustion. The one in back looked over the shoulder of the one in front and paddled furiously. Could it be? Yes, says Steve Joseph.who keeps a copy of the ad on his office wall at Drexel. The fat guy was supposed to be Louis. Merrill Lynch's ad showed two rowing crews, one obese, the other fit and muscular. The fit crew was just inches behind the fat crew and looked about to pass. The fit crew was meant to be Merrill Lynch. The fat crew, as everyone on Wall Street knew, was the Salomon Brothers mortgage trading department.Looking back on his tenure at Salomon from his office at Goldman Sachs, Matara says the peak in profitability was 1985. Deterioration of Ranieri and Co. was so rapid and complete that one is reluctant to attribute it to a single factor, such as the defection of traders. And it is clear that several forces at once eroded its supremacy. One of these forces was the market itself. The market began to right the imbalance between Ranieri and Co. and the rest of the bond trading world. The beautiful inefficiency of mortgage bonds was spoiled for Salomon by one of its own creations, called the Collateralized Mortgage Obligation, CMO. It was invented in June 1983, but not until 1986 did it dominate the mortgage market. The irony is that it achieved precisely what Ranieri had hoped. It made home mortgages look more like other bonds. But making mortgage bonds conformed in appearance had the effect, in the end, of making them only as profitable as other kinds of bonds. Larry Fink, the head of mortgage trading at First Boston, who helped create the first CMO, lists it along with junk bonds as the most important financial innovation of the 1980s. That is only a slight overstatement. The CMO burst the dam between several trillion investable dollars looking for a home and nearly $2 trillion of home mortgages looking for an investor. The CMO addressed the chief objection to buy mortgage securities, still voiced by everyone but thrifts and a handful of adventurous money managers. Who wants to lend money not knowing when he'll get it back? To create a CMO, one gathered hundreds of millions of dollars of ordinary mortgage bonds, Ginnie Mae's, Fannie Mae's, and Freddie Mac's. These bonds were placed in a trust. The trust paid a rate of interest to its owners. The owners had certificates to prove their ownership. These certificates were CMOs. The certificates, however, were not all the same. Take a typical $300 million CMO. It would be divided into 3 tranches of slices of $100 million each. Investors in each tranche received interest payments, but the owners of the first tranche received all principal repayments from all $300 million of mortgage bonds held in trust. Not until first tranche holders were entirely paid off did second tranche investors receive any prepayments. Not until both first and second tranche investors had been entirely paid off did the holder of the third tranche certificate receive repayments. The effect was to reduce the life of the first tranche and lengthen the life of the third tranche in relation to the old-style mortgage bonds. One could say with some degree of certainty that the maturity of the first tranche would be no more than 5 years, and that the maturity of the second tranche would fall somewhere between 7 and 15 years, and that the maturity of the third tranche would be between 15 and 30 years. Now, at last, investors had a degree of certainty about the length of their loans. As a result of CMOs, there was a dramatic increase in the number of investors and volume of trading in the market. For though there was no chance of persuading a pension fund manager looking to make a longer-term loan to buy a Freddie Mac bond that could evaporate tomorrow, one could easily sell him the third tranche of a CMO. He slept more easily at night knowing that before he received a single principal repayment from the trust, $200 million of home mortgage loans had to be prepaid to first and second tranche investors. The effect was astonishing. American pension funds controlled about $600 billion worth of assets in June 1983, when the first CMO was issued by Freddie Mac. None of the money was invested in home mortgages. By the middle of 1986, they held about $30 billion worth of CMOs, and that number was growing fast. CMOs also opened the way for international investors who thought American homeowners were a good bet. In 1987, the London office of Salomon Brothers sold $2 billion of the first tranche of CMOs to international banks looking for higher-yielding short-term investments. The money that flowed into CMOs came from investors new to mortgage bonds, who would normally have purchased corporate or treasury bonds instead. $60 billion of CMOs were sold by Wall Street investment banks between June 1983 and January 1988. That means that $60 billion of new money were channeled into American home finance between June 1983 and January 1988. As with any innovation, the CMO generated massive profits for its creators, Salomon Brothers and First Boston. But at the same time, CMOs redressed the imbalance of supply and demand in mortgages that had created so much opportunity for the bond traders. A trader could no longer bank on mortgages being cheap because of dearth of buyers. By 1986, thanks to CMOs, there were plenty of buyers. The new buyers drove down the returns paid to the investor by mortgage bonds. Mortgages, for the first time, became expensive. The market settled on a fair value for CMOs by comparing them with corporate and treasury bonds. Though this wasn't precisely rational, as there was still no theoretical basis for pricing the homeowner's option to repay his mortgage, the market was growing large enough to impose its own sense of fairness. No longer were the prices of ordinary mortgage bonds allowed to roam inefficiently, for they were now linked to the CMO market in much the same way that flour is linked to the market for bread. Fair value for CMOs implied a fair value for conventional mortgage bonds. Investors now had a new, firm idea of what the price of a mortgage bond should be. This reduced the amount of money to be made exploiting their ignorance. The world had changed. No longer did Salomon Brothers traders buy bonds at 12 and then make the market believe they were worth 20. The market dictated the price, and Salomon Brothers traders learned to cope. After the first CMO, the young Turks of mortgage research and trading found a seemingly limitless number of ways to slice and dice home mortgages. They created CMOs with 5 tranches and CMOs with 10 tranches. They split a pool of home mortgages into a pool of interest payments and a pool of principal payments, then sold the rights to the cash flows from each pool as separate investments. The homeowner didn't know it, but his interest payments might be destined for a French speculator and his principal repayments to an insurance company in Milwaukee. In perhaps the strangest alchemy, Wall Street shuffled the IOs and POs around and glued them back together to create home mortgages that could never exist in the real world. Thus, the 11% interest payment from condominium dwellers in California could be glued to the principal repayments from homeowners in a Louisiana ghetto. And voila, a new kind of bond, a new age Creole, was born. The market trading desk evolved from corner shop to supermarket. By increasing the number of products, they increased the number of shoppers. The biggest shoppers, the thrifts, often had a very particular need. They wanted to grow beyond the limits imposed by the Federal Home Loan Bank Board in Washington. It was a constant struggle to stay one step ahead of thrift regulators in Washington. Many new products invented by Salomon Brothers were outside the rules of the regulatory game. They were not required to be listed on thrift balance sheets and therefore offered a way for thrifts to grow. In some cases, the sole virtue of a new product was its classification as off-balance sheet. To attract new investors and to dodge new regulations, the market became ever more arcane and complex. There was always something new to know, and inevitably Ranieri fell out of touch. The rest of the ozone layer of management at Salomon Brothers had never really been in touch. Therefore, the trading risks were managed by mere tykes, a few months out of a training program, who happened to know more about Ginnie Mae 8% IOs than anyone else in the firm. That a newcomer to Wall Street should all of a sudden be an expert wasn't particularly surprising, since the bonds in question might have been invented only a month before. In a period of constant financial innovation, the youngest people assumed power. A young brain leaped at a chance to know something his superiors did not. The older people was too busy clearing their desktops to stay at the frontiers of innovation. By 1986, Ranieri wasn't even sitting on the trading desk. He was busy ministering to the affairs of the firm. Moreover, his absence made the traders happy. It wasn't that they disliked Louis, but when the managers, Louis and Michael Motara, turned up, they would invariably dabble in the traders' affairs. They'd tell the traders what they should or should not do. They'd want to know exactly why the traders had bought this or that bond. As one of the traders now says, you didn't necessarily have a good reason for every position. Sometimes you bought bonds just to find out what was going on in the street. You didn't want someone hanging around asking why you did such and such. Not surprisingly, the traders found ways to discourage their managers from managing. One week in April 1986, when Ranieri decided he was going to spend some time on a trading desk, the traders' first plot unfolded. Ranieri arrived early each morning, but the traders beat him to the desk. The first day, they piled as much paper as they could find on his desk. Ranieri arrived at 7 a.m., saw the mess, and hit the roof. Who did this? He asked no one in particular. The traders shrugged and giggled. The second day, the traders removed the support pins from the swivel chair at Ranieri's desk. When he sat down first thing in the morning, he crashed to the floor and nearly cracked his spine. It took minutes to hoist him to his feet while he cursed and shouted. This time, he asked the toner who was responsible for the prank. Daytona swore ignorance. The third day, the traders raised Ranieri's swivel chair so that though he sat down safely, when he pulled himself toward his desk, he banged his kneecaps on the center drawer. He was furious. Johnny, I want to know who did this, he said. Well, Louis, says Daytona, I guess Mike just doesn't like you out here on the desk. Who the does he think he is, said Ranieri. He then took all the garbage cans in the department and dumped them on Mortara's desk. Computer printouts, bagel chips, onion cheeseburger scraps, and other trader reviews. The traders joined him in a show of support, gathering the garbage cans from across the trading floor. When they had finished, Mortara's trading desk was buried in a garbage dump. It couldn't have been more perfectly timed in the theater, says one of the traders. Just as Louis was storming off one side of the trading floor, Michael was walking in from the other. When Mortara saw his desk, he responded just as Ranieri had. His first and only thought was revenge. He, too, turned to Daytona and asked, Leroy, I'm serious. Who did this to my desk? Michael, as God is my witness, said Daytona. It was Louis. Mortara was stuck. Ranieri was the one guy he couldn't squash. He blew up the frustration, marched to his office on the 42nd floor, and didn't emerge for the rest of the day. Finally, we have some peace around here, said one of the traders. And though Mortara eventually returned, Ranieri did not. As far as the traders were concerned, that was fine. That month, April 1986, the mortgage trading desk lost more money than ever before, estimated by several traders to have been between $35 and $65 million. The mortgage traders offset the losses with profits they had squirreled away for a rainy day. They had done this by artificially understating the value of bonds on their books. The senior management of Salomon Brothers never knew. The bad times befalling the mortgage department were characteristic of business throughout the firm. The year 1986 was a poor one for Salomon Brothers, and 1987 was worse, as revenues ceased to grow and costs spun out of control. In an effort to install management control, Gutfreund created a wealth of new titles. A board of directors of Salomon Brothers was born, consisting mainly of former traders. On top of the board of directors sat another new level of management, called the Office of the Chairman. To the office, Gutfreund appointed 2 former traders and a former salesman, Louis Ranieri, Bill Voot, and Tom Strauss. Each was asked to detach himself from the little local turf battles he had previously engaged in and to concern himself with the overall welfare of the firm. It was a nice idea. I have this theory, says Andy Stone, seated in his office at Prudential Bay Securities. Wall Street makes its best producers into managers. The reward for being a good producer is to be made a manager. The best producers are cutthroat, competitive, and often neurotic and paranoid. You turn those people into managers, and they go after each other. They no longer have the outlet for the instincts that producing gave them. They usually aren't well suited to be managers. Half of them get thrown out because they are bad. Another quarter get muscled out because of politics. The guys left behind are just the most ruthless of the bunch. That's why they are cycles on Wall Street. Why Salomon Brothers is getting crunched now, because the ruthless people are bad for the business but can only be washed out by proven failure. It was no secret throughout Salomon Brothers that the office of the chairman was divisive. It was simply a carryover from the battle between the 3 pillars of debt, with Strauss representing the government department, Voot representing the corporate department, and Ranieri representing the mortgage department. As a member of the government department put it, around here you are in the Strauss family, the Ranieri family, or the Voot family. Few have been in more than one. The problem wasn't as mild as conflicting team spirit. The office of the chairman was noted for its catty animosities. Ranieri called Tom Strauss all artifice. The man never had an original thought in his life. He called Bill Voot the most political man I've ever met. He never said anything without having a political agenda. He's Machiavellian. But his complaints about his 2 new peers were apparently mild in comparison with the complaints about him. He was willing to work with them. They eventually had him fired. On the other hand, as all 3 lived by the law of the jungle, perhaps it was a matter of their getting him before he got them. Whatever the case, the office of the chairman came to symbolize the force within Salomon Brothers working to dismantle the mortgage department. The government trading desk was a counterpoint to the visible gluttony and ethnicity of the mortgage department. By Salomon standards, it was almost refined, which is to say that it took its meat rare rather than raw. Government traders could have been mistaken for socially conscious East Coast WASPs, had they only been a bit more repressed. Tom Strauss, their leader, was tall, thin, and perpetually tanned. He played tennis. The mortgage traders resented this. They disliked what they interpreted as Strauss' overhead smash of Salmon's Jewish culture. When they talk of Strauss, they rarely fail to mention his game of tennis. They imagine him dressed in whites on the courts of the exclusive club, the two vices of which the mortgage department was free, hypocrisy and pretension, were the vices they least tolerated in others. The difference between Strauss and Ranieri, says one trader still at Salomon, that's easy. Strauss wouldn't stoop to use the men's room on the trading floor. He'd go upstairs. Louis would on your desk. Tom Strauss, says Ranieri, wishes more than anything he wasn't Jewish. Ever since he joined the firm, there's been a joke that some terrible Jewish couple had stolen Tommy from his crib. What Strauss hated about Louis was that he was fat, uneducated, and lacking finesse, says one of Louis' senior traders. Strauss didn't care about Louis' business. He didn't care about Louis' profits. He didn't even care about Louis' vision. He didn't like Louis' lack of couth. Now that may seem like the sort of objection you have the guy sitting next to you, but Louis was the guy sitting next to Strauss. Strauss got to the top and looked to his right and said, "Wait a minute, I thought I had moved up in the world." The Strauss family had strong professional objections to the mortgage department. They disapproved of what they thought were the excesses of the mortgage group. The food frenzies and all the fatness pointed to a more fundamental problem. Costs were most out of control in the mortgage department. Who cared? Revenues had always been what mattered. "You're going to go and change the rules on us now," was the response of a few traders. There had been so much revenue in the mortgage department between 1981 and 1986 that costs were a trivial issue. But as revenue subsided, costs all of a sudden mattered too. A managing director of government sales was moved to the mortgage department in late 1985 and simultaneously put in charge of Salomon's expense committee. That wasn't just a coincidence. Someone had to control these people. Many mortgage traders felt that since they were underpaid to begin with, and their boss agreed they were underpaid, the Salmon Brothers expense account could be used as a soft dollar compensation system. They developed bad habits. We used to send firm limos to pick up friends at the airport. We'd lend our telephone charge cards out to friends. For Christ's sake, people would use Salmon limos to take their wives shopping on the weekends, says one of the traders. "I have the ultimate expense story," says the woman from the mortgage finance department. One of the people in the department put through enough phony expense reports from fictitious trips to visit clients to buy himself a Saab with the proceeds. This irked the Strauss family. Food's feelings toward Ranieri were more a mystery than Strauss's. But then Food himself was more a mystery. While the other managing directors swarmed across the 41st floor trading room, Food was an invisible link high in the chain of authority. He had an office on the 40th floor. He appeared occasionally in the newspapers, but one never actually saw him. The one time I laid eyes on him, he was standing beside his limousine in a photograph over a 1987 article in Business Week. The short article underneath said how Bill Food would sure like to be chairman of Salmon Brothers. In spite of his reclusiveness, the initial move to dismantle the mortgage department came from his corporate bond family. At the insistence of Food and Strauss, a corporate bond managing director named Mark Smith entered the mortgage department at the end of 1985. "You could call him a spy," says one mortgage trader. "You might call him a Trojan horse," says another. "You can't call him a Trojan horse," says a third, "because we all knew what was inside. But Michael won't listen." In fairness, Mortara didn't have much choice but to let the horse through the gates. He could hardly resist the demands of Food and Strauss. Only Ranieri could have done that. The question which had been on the tips of mortgage tongues was voiced for the first time. Where was Louis? Mark Smith was the first big swinging to be second to the mortgage department from some other part of the firm. The department had always been a family characterized by internal solidarity. 6 months after Smith joined them, the first internal squabbles occurred. Smith persuaded Mortara to move Jeff Kronthal off the mortgage desk and into the corporate bond department. Smith then insisted on bringing Larry Stein, a government salesman, into the mortgage arbitrage trading unit, which consisted of Nathan Cornfield, Wolf Naduman, and Greg Hawkins. Stein agreed to move on the condition Naduman be fired. Naduman was a profitable trader, but more important, he was a loyal member of the Ranieri family. Stein belonged to the Strauss family. Nevertheless, at the end of 1986, Matara fired Naduman. The heir was poisoned. Merrill has $250 million loss on unauthorized trading, announced a headline in the Wall Street Journal of April 29, 1987. And then the small print. Executives at Merrill Lynch privately identified the trader as Howard A. Rubin, 36 years old, who had been the firm's head mortgage trader. They said he had far exceeded his limits in acquiring mortgages that were packaged into a particularly risky form of securities. The package involved splitting off the interest payments on the mortgages from the principal and selling each separately. They are known as interest-only, principal-only securities, or IOPOs. Wall Street reporters were frantically trying to find out both who this man, Howie Rubin, was and what was meant by IOPOs. And though they eventually learned how Howie Rubin lost more money on a single trade than anyone in the history of Wall Street, remained one of the most beguiling mysteries on Wall Street. Not only had he seemed until that point to be one of those people who always landed on their feet, but he had been a raw talent. In the words of Louis Ranieri, Howie Rubin was the most gifted trader I have ever seen. The story Merrill Lynch gave to the press was that Rubin had deceived them. A Merrill executive told the Wall Street Journal that Rubin just put them in his drawer. We didn't know he owned them. Just put them in his drawer. Could the upper management of a leading firm like Merrill Lynch be caught so entirely off guard? A couple of weeks before the loss was announced, Rubin had lunched with a large buyer of mortgage bonds, Ernie Fleischer of Franklin Saving and Loan in Ottawa, Kansas. Thrift management in general was slowly improving, and Fleischer was at the vanguard of the change. He prided himself on beating Wall Street at his own game. Rubin explained IOs and POs to Fleischer. Fleischer liked what he heard, and while they were still at the lunch table, Fleischer asked Rubin to sell him $500 million of IOs. In agreeing, Rubin took a flyer. He sold Fleischer the interest payments on $500 million worth of bonds. That left him with the principal portion of the same bonds. The deal was consummated over dessert. Fleischer returned to Ottawa and later boasted how he had made $10 million taking the other side of a trade that cost the Wall Street stickers a fortune. The problem for Howie Rubin was how to dispose of his $500 million of POs. No bond plummets faster when interest rates go up than a PO. Rubin's risk was, therefore, that the bond market would fall before he had a chance to sell the POs. The bond market, when he returned from lunch, felt jittery, and he tried to offload his POs through the Merrill Lynch sales force, but it was unable to sell them. Then the market collapsed. After a couple of days, Rubin found himself with a loss too large to admit. Some say that at this point he bought more POs, doubled up his bet. Though it would certainly have been in character, there's no evidence he did anything of the kind. No one seems to know why things go out of hand. Yet everyone has an opinion. And what all of Rubin's former Salmon teammates swear, from Louis Ranieri on down, is that Howie Rubin didn't hide the bonds in any drawer. The only version of the story they accept is that the management of Merrill Lynch hadn't a clue what a PO was, hadn't established any rules for its use, had permitted Rubin to assume a huge risk, and then used him as a scapegoat for his ignorance. In the newspaper stories that followed the incident, anonymous traders from Salmon Brothers were quoted repeatedly defending Howie Rubin. It was as if he was still part of the Ranieri family. To split a mortgage bond into its interest and principal components, the bond must first be registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission. SEC registration is a public event. The rest of Wall Street, therefore, saw Howie Rubin at Merrill Lynch register to issue $500 million of IOPOs. Mark Smith, Voot and Strauss men in the mortgage department took note. He argued that Salmon Brothers should follow suit. On the face of it, his suggestion made sense. The Merrill Lynch package of IOs and POs was overpriced. Smith figured that if Merrill could sell the fragments of mortgage bonds for such high prices, then Salomon, with its stronger sales force, should have no problem with a similar cheaper deal. What he didn't know, of course, is whether Howie Rubin had actually sold his entire deal. But investment banks love nothing more than to undercut one another. So Salomon did the deal. Salomon issued $250 million worth of IOPOs. By pointing out that the Salomon POs were cheaper than the Merrill Lynch POs, the Salomon sales force managed to move the dreaded things out the door to investors before the market collapsed. Of course, this completely undermined Howie Rubin's efforts to escape disaster. And that left Salomon Brothers in a position similar to Ernie Fleischer. It owned IOs, which rose in price when the bond market went down. And that was fine. Everyone at Salomon expected the market to crash. And instead of offering the IOs to public, the firm kept them on as a bet. The Mortgage Arbitrage Group, consisting of Greg Hawkins, Nathan Kornfeld, and Nathan Lowe, bought $125 million of the things. And a group of traders managed by Liar's Poker champion John Merriweather bought the rest. Only one trader on the 41st floor of Salomon Brothers seemed to have a view that differed from the rest, Mark Smith. In his trading account, he, like Howie Rubin, owned hundreds of millions of dollars of POs. Smith was known around Salomon as an able speculative trader. His nose told him the bond market was due for a rally. He felt so sure of his bet that he told Hawkins, Kornfeld, and Lowe how stupid they were to bet against him. He occasionally wandered past John Merriweather's boys to tell them that he, not they, had made the right gamble. The bond market felt good. It was going up. When the market first dropped, it dropped slowly, but it was enough to wreak the havoc at Merrill Lynch that made the front page of the Wall Street Journal. A few days before a story, market rumor alerted Salomon Brothers that Merrill Lynch was sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars of POs it needed to sell. After a couple of days of decline, Smith, who had lost a small fortune but was still in the market, took a body count and decided that it was time to buy a few more POs. After all, Merrill Lynch was panicking, and that, as we all know, presents a chance to buy cheaply. So he bought more POs, and though they were not precisely the ones Howie Rubin owned, his position was virtually identical to Rubin's. For the next few days, the market stayed calm. When the market resumed its decline, it fell famously, like the apple from the tree. Both Merriweather's boys and the Mortgage Arbitrage Department very quickly made tens of millions of dollars. Smith, however, began to lose even more millions of dollars. Estimates of his losses by four people close to his situation range between $35 and $75 million. But it didn't matter. Meanwhile, the mortgage arbitrage traders kept their IOs, and their profits were growing. That gave Smith, a veteran schemer, an idea for how to get his money back. He began by telling people in high places that all along his bonds had been meant to be bundled together with the bonds held by the Mortgage Arbitrage Group, Hawkins, Kornfeld, and Lowe. He said it often enough, and he was senior enough, that the right people apparently chose to believe him. After all, he was effectively a boss of mortgage trading. He then informed the mortgage arbitrage traders that their profitable IOs actually belonged in his trading account. He said he had planned to package his POs at his purchase price with their IOs at their purchase price and sell them off to investors. So the mortgage arbitrage profits were swallowed up by Smith's losses. Smith was stealing profits from other traders. What was worse, in the view of the mortgage traders, Smith was a corporate trader. It was a signal to everyone that something was very rotten in Salomon Brothers. A member of the ARB group recalls that it got so we'd come in the morning and say, "Oh, we made another $2 million on the IOs. Guess Smith will take that too." Later, much later, Smith would be severely reprimanded in Gutfreund's office for what he had done. But that would be too little too late. Kornfeld quit and joined Shearson Lehman. Lowe quit and went to work for Bear Stearns. Even Larry Stein, whom Smith had introduced to the mortgage department, quit in disgust. For a brief time, there were calls from around the firm for Smith's head, but that ended when the rest of the mortgage trading department was fired. Where had Louis been? Although it was not widely known, while Smith was poaching profits from the mortgage arbitrage books, Ranieri was, in his mind anyway, no longer officially in charge of mortgage trading. In December 1986, John came to me and said, "I want to dismantle the mortgage department. I want you to help manage the firm as a whole." Says Ranieri, The department didn't exist as a separate entity. It was a part of fixed income trading, he says. In May 1987, John Gutfreund told Salomons 112 managing directors at the annual Managing Directors Weekend in New York, "We created an office of the chairman because running Salomon Brothers is beyond the scope of any one man. As with any team, the challenge is to share the task, bring a diversity of opinions and insights, and yet work with a singularity of purpose. I am very pleased with how the group is scaling. Over time, the other three members will gravitate to fewer direct line responsibilities in order to have more time for firm management." 2 months later, in July 16, 1987, he fired Ranieri. Ranieri had been on business on the West Coast when he heard from Gutfreund's secretary that Gutfreund wanted to see him. He was told to meet Gutfreund in the Midtown office of Wachtell Lipton, the prominent securities law firm. "We met up there in Marty's office when we didn't want to create a fuss and there was an emergency," says Ranieri. "I thought the South Africans, i.e. Minorco, wanted out of their shares. I had no idea what was up." The meeting lasted about 10 minutes and left Ranieri stunned. When asked why he was fired, Ranieri says, "I still don't know." Gutfreund gave Ranieri 3 reasons at the time, all of which Ranieri found absurd. He started out by telling Ranieri, "No one likes you anymore." Then he said that Ranieri was a disruptive force and that he'd become too big for Salomon Brothers. When Ranieri moved to adjourn the meeting and drive downtown to collect his belongings, Gutfreund told him he wouldn't be permitted in the building. Clearly, the thought of a coup or a general strike had crossed Gutfreund's mind, as large numbers of Salomon employees owned a chief allegiance to Ranieri. Ranieri's secretary was to be allowed to pack his personal effects in the company of the Salomon security guard. When news reached mortgage desks that Louis had been fired, the toner was visibly shaking, says one mortgage trader still at Salomon. It was clear to everyone, to Louis, to Wolf Naduman, now at Dillon Reed, to Nate Kornfeld, now at Shears and Lehman, to Andy Stone, now at Prudential Beige, to everyone left on the mortgage desk, what would happen next? The Ranieri family would be purged. Over a period of a few months, the firm fired what was left of the old guard on the mortgage trading desk, beginning the next day with the head of training, Michael Mortara, then John DeTona, Ron DiPasquale, Peter Marrow, and Tom Granella. The lone trader of Italian descent left on the desk was Paul Leganotti, who appeared at work one day wearing a button that said, "Fire me, I'm Italian." The sole trace of the origins of one of the most unusual and profitable businesses in the history of Wall Street is a picture. It hangs in Jim Massey's office, and it shows Gutfreund, Ranieri, and Bob Dahl crossing hands to signify the founding of their joint venture in 1978. Jeff Kronthal and Mason Holt were allowed to stay as co-heads of mortgage trading, presumably because no one else at Salomon Brothers knew enough to do the job. The following year, however, Kronthal quit to become vice chairman of LF Rothschild, a New York investment bank recently purchased by, of all people, thrift manager Ernie Fleischer. That left Mason Holt as the only man at Salomon Brothers expert in mortgage securities. The ignorance about mortgage bonds at the top of the firm was truly remarkable. After the purge, Gutfreund, Voot, and Strauss arranged to have a private seminar given by the head of Salomon Bond Research, Marty Leibowitz. The subject, an introduction to mortgage securities. Voot was eventually named head of mortgage trading. Ranieri had accomplished what he set out to do, put the mortgage department on equal footing with corporate and government bonds. The U.S. mortgage market is now the largest credit market in the world and may one day be the single largest bond market in the world. Ranieri's creation signaled a shift in the focus of Wall Street. Wall Street, historically, had dealt with only one side of the balance sheet, liabilities. Mortgages are assets. If home mortgages could be packaged and sold, so could credit card receivables, car loans, and any other kind of loan you can imagine. Salomon Brothers' expertise fertilized the rest of Wall Street. Michael Mortara became the head of mortgage trading at Goldman Sachs, the leader in mortgage bond trading in the first half of 1988. Peter Marrow heads mortgage trading at Morgan Guaranty. Andy Stone heads mortgage trading at Prudential Beige. Steve Baum heads mortgage trading at Kidder Peabody. Tom Kendall heads mortgage trading at Greenwich Capital Markets. Steve Joseph heads mortgage trading at Drexel Burnham Lambert. Jeff Kronthal heads mortgage trading at LF Rothschild. Wolf Naduman, Nathan Kornfeld, Nathan Lowe, Bill Esposito, Eric Bibler, and Ravi Joseph are senior mortgage traders for, respectively, Security Pacific, Shearson Lehman, Bear Stearns, Greenwich Capital Markets, Merrill Lynch, and Morgan Stanley. That is a handful of the most visible Salomon mortgage traders on Wall Street. Beneath them in their corporations are thousands of people who now make their living in mortgage bonds. Of course, the most curious of all former Salomon Brothers mortgage traders is Harry Rubin. Soon after being fired by Merrill Lynch, Rubin was hired by Bear Stearns. Rumor had it that Bear Stearns called him the morning the news of his $250 million loss hit the Wall Street Journal. Outside Merrill Lynch, Rubin's loss was taken in stride, even with humor. A pair of Bear Stearns mortgage traders nailed shut his new desk drawers so that he couldn't just put them in his drawer again. A Salmon mortgage trader telephoned to suggest that Rubin volunteered for an American Express card commercial. Hi, you don't know me, but I lost more money trading than anyone in the history of Wall Street, so I know the meaning of credit, and when I get in trouble, I pull out this little card. Louis Ranieri opened his own firm half a mile north of Salomon Brothers. Soon after his dismissal, a confused Ranieri had lunch with the man who had dragged him kicking and screaming into mortgages, Bob Dow. Dow says, I have two theories why John fired Louis so soon after he had promoted him. One is that John realized all of a sudden he had made a huge error, that Louis was too parochial and would put his department first, even if he was vice chairman of the firm. The second theory is that the office of the chairman got sick of listening to Louis. Louis dominates a meeting. He's not the kind of a guy who likes to hear himself talk, but he has all these passionate beliefs. It's too bad that Strauss, Voot, and Gutfreund couldn't take it, because they could have benefited from listening to Louis. Ranieri himself refused to believe he was done in by the man who had protected him when things were tough, the man he called my rabbi. He believes that Tom Strauss managed to obtain control and that Voot was willing to bide his time, while giving Strauss enough rope to hang himself. Ranieri has never relinquished his notion of the firm, formed when the faceless, nameless partner paid his wife's hospital bills for no reason other than it was the right thing to do, when the firm was run by men who said it is more important to be a good man than a good manager, and meant it. Ranieri prefers to think of Salomon Brothers as temporarily in the hands of strangers to its culture. The only way you can understand what happens, says Ranieri, is that John Gutfreund is not in control. Strauss was in control. Tommy wanted absolute power. They managed to destroy a colossus in a year. John would have never done that to himself if he were making the decisions. I can't imagine what they said to John to get him to do what he did. They never understood that the greatness of the firm was its culture. They shattered the culture, or as the people say, they broke the covenant. They branded themselves forevermore. And with that, a 19-year journey from a Wall Street mailroom to a Wall Street boardroom ended. 好，呢一節就有啲意興闌珊啦，講到唔單止呢個 mortgage department 嘅完全嘅消失啦，再加埋 mortgage department 嘅 founder 啦，可以咁講啦 ，Louis Ranieri 嘅被解僱，而佢被解僱嘅原因咧係一個莫須有嘅罪名啦，而佢亦都冇去面對呢個事實，就係的確係 John Gutfreund 佢自己嘅決定啦。佢就情願去相信係同佢同級嘅人咧，譬如係 Strauss 啊呢啲咁嘅人係唆擺啊 John Gutfreund。OK， 好，咁我哋睇下呢一節有啲咩字同大家分享先。今次揀啲經濟金融類啲嘅啦。Tranche 名詞嚟嘅 ，a portion of something, especially money， 金額嘅一部分啦，金融協議 Tranche。第二個字 Machiavellian 係名詞，同時間亦都係一個形容詞。喺文中咧，佢話某人佢係一個 Machiavellian， 意思即係好 cunning 嘅、scheming 嘅、unscrupulous， especially in politics。中文就翻譯做馬基亞佛利主義馬基亞佛利主義 Machiavellian， 即係 unscrupulous 咧，之前都有同大家講過隻字，意思即係為求目的就不擇手段啦。仲有Parochial 呢個形容詞嚟嘅 Having a limited or narrow outlook or scope. Louis Ranieri 去到好後期，俾Gutfreund去開除嗰陣時候，就數落佢啦。其中就係話佢 Parochial， 意思即係咩？即係話佢睇嘢咧好狹隘，即係目光咧淺窄咁樣。OK， 今日同大家分享呢度，下次再同大家見面，拜拜。